Okay, mic test, mic test. This is mic test.
Good evening, everybody. We are live streaming out to the rest of the world tonight. So if I could ask you to make sure your phones are turned off, that would be fantastic. Thank you so much for coming along tonight. You've probably all had plans to go and have a really nice dinner somewhere, but I assure you that you won't be disappointed in coming here instead and listening to Rose Garn speak about her amazing novels. It's been a long relationship actually with Rose over the years since she started writing these books, and to see it all come to fruition has been quite a journey, and fantastic to see a different aspect on history. And I think Rose will go into this a lot more than I will. You didn't come here to see me, so I'm going to hand over to Rose's daughter, Rose Garn Rankin, and she's going to guide you through the night. And I'll just pop back and have a quick chat at the end. So thank you very much for coming along. Thank you.
Just a note. Oh, you can really hear me now. Just a note. My name is Zoe Gann, not Rose Gann. Just so there's no confusion. And I am Rose's daughter, but I will also be acting today as the moderator. Before I introduce Rose, I would like to just give you a run through of what to expect this evening. Well, Rose will be starting with a presentation that will give you an overview of the 3 books that she's published, but with a focus on the book that's being launched today, Emporium. We will follow that by a moderated, informal discussion between Rose and I. And this will be a little bit like as if you're sat around the table, our dinner table, peeping into the kind of conversations or stroke arguments that we have over dinner. If any of you are familiar with family dinners, that's what that bit will be about. That will be followed by Rose giving a first extract of one of the chapters. Then we will go into an interactive session where you get to grill Rose on the books and the process that she went through to write the books and perhaps any of the characters. But I must stress that during the informal kind of moderated discussion between Rose and I, if you have any burning questions, just stick your hand up. We'll make sure that a microphone gets to you. You can ask that question. We don't want it to be too formal. And finally, we will end with a second extract of Emporium, another 5-minute speech by Rose, a reading by Rose. And then we'll close, but we'll stay on for half an hour at the end. So if you've bought a book or you've brought your own book, then please get it signed and have a chat with Rose. But if you're in a rush to get off, we have book plates, little stickers that Rose has already signed that you can stick in your book so that you've got that memento. So without further ado, I will introduce to you Rose Gann from the perspective of not my mother. I'm going to read this, just to make sure I get it right. British by birth, Rose Gann has been based in Southeast Asia for many years with her husband, her Malaysian husband and family, living in Penang, Bangkok, and Jakarta. With an academic background in ancient and medieval history and classical languages, Rose worked for many years as a teacher and then later on as a docent in various museums in Malaysia and also in Indonesia. Rose has also contributed to various publications in museums as both writer and editor. Rose is now based in Kuala Lumpur and mostly tied to her writing her current new novel. She's also spends a lot of time knitting, a singularly useless hobby in Malaysia, due to the weather, although it's quite cold in this room, so perhaps it's not that useless. And also her third passion is perfecting her sourdough bread. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Rose Gann, who will take us away with a presentation.
I hope you can hear me. I have a teacher voice, so I usually am heard even without microphone. Please let me know if you can't. Welcome this evening. It's a delight to be here at last in Penang to talk about my novels. As you can see from my title, it says "In a New Light," no pun intended. And you might be wondering, what is there new to say about Francis Straits that hasn't been said by much more skillful people than me? And of course, I'm not giving you any new information. There is no new information that I have discovered in my research. Of course not. By new light, what I am bringing to the story is, I hope, ask a few new questions of the existing evidence. And I think most of what the popular history is based on, and by popular, I'm not talking about what scholars write or academics theses. I'm talking about the story that many of you Penangites got at school, or you the chapter in a book about Penang, and it says the beginning is all about Francis Light, or in a newspaper article. That's the sort of popular history, and that popular history hasn't changed in a very, very long time. And most people are still quoting the story they learned at school. And of course, a lot more is known about Francis Light than that. To give you an example, though, of how important it is for every age to relook at the past and ask it new questions, I'm going to start talking about where did the information for the popular version of the story come from. So I'm going to start by talking about the biographers. And the three main biographers, and if you can't see, there's a screen at the back and you can see the writing, were all gentlemen of around the same period. They were all born in the latter half of the 19th century to the early 20th century. So they were people with a certain worldview, mindset. They were also all men. So the questions that they would ask of the sources might be quite different from the questions somebody in the 21st century would ask of those sources. They won't be looking at things that maybe I'm interested in. So perhaps it's time to go back a little bit and ask a few questions. Just to tell you a little bit about these people, because I find them quite fascinating. The first one, A.M. Skinner, was a soldier. So we can already see where his angle might be. But also, he wrote a monograph about Light on the 100th anniversary of his death. So it's there to celebrate this great man of our, of our colonial world. The one on the left, Archibald Stewart, was a very young man when he wrote in 1901 his biography, which is not really a biography, it's a collection of sources about Francis Light, because he was a descendant of Francis Light. He was descended from Mary Light, one of the girls. He was a Scottish gentleman because eventually she ended up in Scotland. And he wrote his book in his late 20s, and he quite openly admits it, to sort of give the family story. Now, he had some access to some really important stuff because he had private papers and extracts from diaries. His record is really important, but it's not really a biography. He just puts all the information he's got and links it together with little comments. But it's quite clear if you read it carefully. There's some areas he's not prepared to go down to. When writing about Francis Light's origins, he said very obscure. He doesn't want to use the word illegitimate, not to the family. When he mentions William Nagan, his Francis's father, or the benefactor who raised him, he says vaguely related. Now, what does exactly that mean? So you can see that there's a sort of gloss what he's about to talk about Martina. He tells you what a few people say, but he says the family prefer to think of her as a princess. So again, it's definitely been affected by the family. He didn't want to say his aunts and uncles and all the rest of it. The third one, by Harold Clodd, he was an important man in the FMS, in the Federated Malay States. And he was actually the director of Bukit Kepong Rubber Company. But at the same time, he was at the head of everything in KL and Selangor, chairman of the Selangor Club, chairman of the Chamber of Commerce, Chamber of the Christian Men's Association. So he was right bang there as an important man in the colonial world. And he wrote his book when he'd retired in his old age. So and it's called the first British pioneer. So you can see he's explaining where the world I've benefited from, I've lived in, has come from. So the only things he's going to talk about are the things that matter to him. Anything below his vision, it's not that he's ignoring it, it's just he doesn't think it's important. But each of those three men have used good sources. They're not making it up. They're using the right sources, but they're telling you what they think is important out of those sources. So what are we not learning from those biographies? And that was my starting point, I suppose. Now, I was going to say, as a woman of the 21st century, I want to give a 21st viewpoint. But I'm not a woman of the 21st century, really, am I? I was born in 1955, right? I'm a woman of the late 20th century. That's my mindset. So, of course, I'm fixed on things that were important to me in my development as an adult. I'm not, what they say now, Gen Z or a millennial or all these terms which I don't really understand anyway. But all those people who do fall into, and there's a few younger people in this room, you should be asking questions of the things that are relevant to your age, not to modernize history. That's not what I'm talking about. But to see if we can tease out of the past something that nobody's ever teased out before. But we can only do that by strict adherence, I'm a historian by training, to the facts as they are. And unfortunately, most of the facts were put together by the British. We've got to find, I'm trying to find a way that we can use Francis Wright and his story and his world as a conduit into what I really want to know about. And what I really want to know about is, well, I'm a woman, so I want to know a little bit about the women. I'm also married to a Chinese. My children are children of a mixed heritage. I'm very fascinated by that. But I also have lived most of my life in Malaysia or Thailand or Indonesia. So I want to tell, well, what was going on in the Straits while this was all? What were the people of the Straits feeling about this story? So that's my standpoint. It's on the other side of the story. But can I find that story from the historical sources? So that's what my books are about. I started off wanting to write a history of Martina. It was impossible. So I ended up writing novels. So I'm trying to keep us true to the history, but I'm also, at some point, going to have to create the bits that are impossible to find. So let's go on. So just a quick look through the three novels. The first one, Dragon. Now, Francis Light is the dragon, okay? Or the British are the dragon. That's the male fiery dragon, the ones who are going to, sort of conquer. And my book covers all the major stuff that you already know, and I don't necessarily need to go through the facts about his background and his benefactor, his school days, his time in the Navy, and then the East India Company involvement in Madras and onwards. There's a lot of information out there, really a lot of information, not necessarily about Francis Light, because he was, especially in his early days, not a very celebrated person. But if you're in the Navy, there's massive records on the Navy. As long as you know what ships he was on, you know where he was, what theatre of war, who he was fighting, who his captain was. It's absolutely wonderful material for a novelist because the story tells itself. Navy records are just unbelievable. You go onto these sites, you tap in a ship's name, and out comes every port they ever stopped in, every captain, every important person on board. You can just simply tell a whole story just by, I mean, who compiles these lists? I don't know, but they're wonderful for people like me. And then, of course, as soon as he got involved in the East India Company is a massive bureaucratic institution which has records and letters and council minutes and They're very dry and dusty, yes, but the story's there between the pages. So it's very easy to pick up a narrative for Francis Light. But the main story, of course, although I do spend half the book on the earlier part of Light's life, the main story begins when he gets to the Straits. This is what we're interested in. Now, he was a country trader, a country ship captain. Now, if that sort of role for a man who'd come out of the Navy is a bit of a step down, because basically he's the bottom feeder of the East India Company. These are the English captains who do the hard yards. They go out into all the tiny little ports along the Straits and Burma and Phuket and Aceh and all around this region, fueling the machine of the East India Company, bringing goods that are needed for the China trade, or obviously selling the goods they want to offload, or the weapons they want to offload, or the opium they want to sell. At the same time, country traders are doing a little bit of their own on the side, right? So 'cause they have to make their own money. So people who come up in that world have got to be tough. Many country ship captains don't last very long. But there's a lot written about country traders, so you can learn a lot about the kind of man he must have been. He had to be a linguist. You've got a crew of lascars that speaking all different languages. You're going into all different ports, so he was a linguist. He actually even read in Siamese as well, spoke it, and he could read Jawi. So his Malay is obviously very good. So he's a very good linguist. You have to be tough, hard, brutal, maybe. Ruthless. You have to be all these things to survive in a world like that. But you also, by the same token, have to be you have to be charming, and you have to work to the gab and work your way into people's trust. And the interesting thing about Light is, more than most country traders, is within a relatively short time, he is known by all the movers and shakers of the Straits. I'm not talking now about the East India Company. They kind of know him, but they don't pay much notice of him. But the sultans seem very taken by the Sultan of Aceh, the Sultan of Kedah, the Bugis, the Bugis of Riau. All these movers and shakers in the local world are very taken by him and are quite willing to offer him a place to settle. They're quite willing, where the British have not been able to break in before. Francis sees so much potential for himself, so he keeps talking to the East India Company, who is this illegitimate son of a nobody who is gone a bit native, you know, and in fact, the more he seems to fit in the Straits, the less he seems to fit in with the East India Company. So he's banging his head against the wall there, very, very well thought of by the powerful people in the Straits, who are, if you look at my map, well, the Sultan of Aceh, that's a power, and it's also very connected with the Arab world, but most of Sumatra is Dutch. Okay, so on the west, you've got the Dutch, and across Malacca, so the Straits are well held by the Dutch and the British are not, they're rivals. I wouldn't say they were enemies, but they were rivals, very much so. In the north, Siam is a very powerful kingdom. Now, it's on the brink of war with Burma at the moment when Francis enters the Straits. How's that going to go? How's that going to affect the sultans? Because after all, the sultans of the Northern States are technically part of the Siamese kingdom. They send tribute to them. If things go wrong, what's going to happen to the northern sultans? Down in the south, you've got an even greater problem. And don't forget, this was the big problem for the sultans in the day, much more so than the British. What's going to happen about the Bugis of Riau? Now, they've come over from Sulawesi. They're more enemies of the Dutch because the Dutch turfed them out of Sulawesi. And they have set themselves up as traders, a very, very prosperous base at Bintan. And the Dutch don't like it. So there's lots of conflicts between the Dutch and the Bugis. But regardless of that, the Bugis have are starting to worm their way up the peninsula. They're now controlling Johor. Johor controlled Pahang, so they've got a big swathe of the south. And in 1765, Raja Lumu, the Bugis leader, became the first Sultan of Selangor. So now they've got Selangor. So bit by bit, they're inching up the peninsula. So those sultans are trapped on every side by enemies. Francis knows this. He says, I see that I am the man who could find a British base. Now, the British need a base because their interest is the China trade. And it's a long, long way through the Straits of Malacca, South China Seas, to China without a friendly port. So you can see that the geopolitics of the region isn't all the British story. There's a massive story going on in the Straits. And although Francis feels he can find a place, the British are not listening very hard for a long time. And eventually, in Dragon, he gets his first major opportunity. So that is the book of the String. Now, that is a very politic-heavy story. It's war, it's navy, it's politics. Who wants to read a novel about that? Well, that's not all, right? So there's a lot of characters in this book who don't fit into that. Now, I have taken the liberty of casting my movie version of this because it's easy for you to think in terms of an image. And it's what I do when I'm writing. If I have to describe somebody, how am I going to describe them if I don't have an image? So if I can't find an image of the person, I find something that looks like I imagine they would look, and then I describe from that. So we've got a Nyonya lady who's going to be an important character in the book. This is a famous portrait, which is sometimes called the geisha lady, sometimes called the Eurasian lady, sometimes called the Nyonya lady. Take your pick, but I use that image in a sense in my book. Then we have the fascinating Lady Chan of Phuket. Now, this is a story that not a lot of people know about, but Phuket at this period was really run by a woman, another forgotten woman of history, as we were talking about before. She was the daughter, wife, and later mother and aunt of governors of Phuket, but she controlled all the men in the family. But she was at the same time the main economic trading powerhouse. And she's very, very close to France. It's like there are letters, many letters between them. He helps her in her old age when things go a bit awry. She eventually becomes the heroine lady with the sister of Phuket. If you're ever in Phuket, you might see the statues to the two of them. She drives off the Burmese in the story in the end. So she is a fascinating, powerful female character. Who talks about her? I do. So she's in this book, and she's in the second book as well. So her story's carried through. Then we've got people like Warren Hastings, who is the great Governor General, who is the first Governor General of the East India Company to really try to stop the corruption. So they all hate him. So they do their very best to get rid of him. But he's by light. He's the first real East India Company character who sees something in light. So he's in the book. There's the Sultan of Kedah. He's very major. Sultan Muhammad Jiwa of Kedah, who reigned for an awfully long time. Legend says it was 80 years. I think that's probably a bit of a stretch, but he certainly ruled a long time. And in that time, he fought off many palace coups, Bugis attacks, problems with the Dutch, problems with the Siamese. This is an old guy spinning plates for many years, and he likes light, and he thinks light might be the person to solve his plate problem. And he's a very important person in the story. Then we have at the top Solomon, and he's my sort of made-up character, although he did actually exist. He's a young Malay boy that I imagine Light adopted, because many of these great colonial figures had a mentor from the Malay community, and he's the little child who actually helps Light learn the language and helps him understand the culture. So he's my, if you like, voice of the Orang Selat, voice of the Straits people. As he grows and he's challenged by his position, we learn to see Light's story through his eyes. And finally, James Scott, who arguably had more role in the development of early Penang than Light did, because he certainly lived longer, and was Light's great friend and partner. Now, a question for you. Which one of these is the only one taken from a life portrait? Is the only life portrait? Any ideas? Anyone brave enough to shout a name out? Sorry? No, not James Scott. The Sultan of Kedah. Nearly right, because that is a Sultan of Kedah, just not that Sultan of Kedah. It's a different Sultan of Kedah. Warren Hastings, right? Because he's the only man important enough there to have his portrait painted, right? Even Light, we don't know what he looked like, really, because the Light statue is taken from his son. So people just didn't have their portraits painted in those days. The Solomon at the top is actually Ali Wallace, who was Russell Wallace's adopted son. The Sultan of Kedah there is Sultan, I always get the names wrong, Hamid Halim or Halim Hamid. Very famous Sultan of Kedah from 1899 to 1945. But he was my image because he ruled a very long time and was a very interesting character. And the James Scott is James Scott, but not our James Scott. He's James Scott who had same birth, same death, virtually years, but was in the Emporium. But I just found his picture, thought, that'll do. He's called James Scott, and that's my image. So there you've got some of my many characters in the book. Pearl. Now, Pearl is Martina's book. She is the Pearl. Penang is the Pearl. Both of those two characters are featured in this book. And I go back in time at the beginning of this because I have to then put together a life story for Martina. And she's a created person in the story. I will talk about later how I did that. But unlike Frances, we don't have any records that we can look at. There's no one going to talk about her because she's from the Straits, because she's a woman, nobody's going to talk about the background to her life. So we have very little information to build on. But I've recreated Martina's birth in Phuket, her life, her childhood in Kedah, and then her meeting and relationship with Light and their family. At the same time, Light's own story is building up steam. Back and forth to Calcutta. It's a very, very dangerous time. There's another player in the story now. The French are in the story because it's the Revolutionary Wars, and the French send their warships to this area, and the French ally with the Dutch. And now it's really getting dangerous. It's getting to a pivotal point. And Light and Scott personally are involved in that. Their lives are threatened with that. So it's narrative magic for an author. There's so much going on there. And then we end with the settlement of Penang. But I have to stop and talk about Martina, because I think for most people, and certainly most women, she's the one who we want to know more about, right? She is the enigma of the story. And all we know for sure is that she was either a Malay princess, or she was that Nyonya lady. That picture was on the other side, the ambassador for the Sultan of Kedah who went to Aceh, or she was a Portuguese Eurasian, which kind of makes sense because her name is kind of Portuguese and she was a Catholic. How can anyone be? I mean, they're so different. How can anyone be all those things? So most people pick one of them and stick with it. Well, I decided I wasn't going to do that. I was deciding I was going to think of a world where she could be all those things, because people of the Straits have very mixed heritage, and many people can belong to more than one group, and they exhibit different characteristics when they're in different groups. I see it with my own children. You know, they're Chinese when they're with their Chinese relatives, and when they're in home in Manchester, they are just Mancunian kids. You know, they go to football and do all the normal things. People are very slide between two worlds. But how does the outside world see them? You know, so sometimes you've got to be one thing or another. So I'm wondering, could she have had a bit of a lot of things in her? Could she be sort of an epitome of the Straits? And so she's giving her Straits view of the whole story. So that was my feeling about the enigmatic Martinha Rozells. Both these pictures at different times, people have said are Martina. Do I think they are? No, I don't. But again, even the two pictures are complete enigmas because they're completely different women. One is a Malay, one is a Chinese or a Eurasian or whatever. That doesn't help us solve the problem. Was she Light's wife, or was she his mistress? Light himself said cohabited with her for many years. Even he doesn't mention in his will that she's his wife. Well, I have a feeling, because I'm a Catholic and I'm a Catholic Irish background, and I know even in my lifetime the trouble that sometimes could cause in Britain. And I mean, Tony Blair, the Prime Minister, his wife was Catholic, and some say that he became a Catholic. And still, you can't be Prime Minister of England if you're a Catholic. So, you know, go back 250 years, like how the attitude was to Catholicism. So I think there may be something more behind that story. It wasn't something you could necessarily go into, but maybe it's something you could ask a question about later, and we'll say a little bit more about that. But they did have children, and they had 5 living children. There could have been more. We don't really know. All listed there, and we have pictures now. We're now in an age when the Light family have got enough renown for there to be pictures. On the top left, you've got Sarah Light, the oldest child, and the picture below is her as a more mature woman, we think. We're only absolutely sure about the top one. We just think that the other one is her as a more mature woman. On the right, we have William Light, who is the very famous founder of Adelaide, and he was an artist himself, and some say he painted this himself, although it's not 100% sure, about 1814, 1815. One thing I'm fascinated, and look carefully at the faces, how alike young Sarah Light and William Light look. I mean, they're very similar features. They're definitely, around the nose and eyes, they're definitely brother and sister. But one thing you have to say is they do not look as if they're of mixed heritage. And then that's the problem with their portrait, as Henry VIII went to his cost with Anne of Cleves, isn't it? You know, you can say to an artist, especially if you paint your own picture, I want my image to be the image that I want the public to see. So it may not be 100% And later pictures of William Light that he draws of himself show him as much more swarthy and dark, very dark-eyed. Yes, yes, that's right. His statue's in Adelaide. So maybe a picture can be problematic because it's not necessarily. Well, I was going to say a photograph is more accurate, but not these days because you can touch up any photo now. So I mean, we're beyond truth in any of these things. But they were significant lives they went on to have. So I cast the Pearl characters, and again you can see it's not all a British story by any means. In fact, there's only one European on that page as a major character in Pearl, and she actually was German, and of course the British would not count that the same anyway. You know? And she is Warren Hastings' mistress, then wife. Somewhat controversial character in Calcutta, and I imagine the conversation she might have had with Martina and what she might have to say with a girl who was at the fish out of water in Calcutta, girl from the Straits, and how she felt a bit of a fish out of water with the British. I think that's a bit of an artistic license that they met, but it's just one way that I could give a different insight into Calcutta life with her point of view. But all the other characters are from the region. We have King Taksin, the King of Siam, who was a very close friend. Well, I say close friend, what kind of word is that? They knew each other very well. You don't become a close friend of a King of Siam. But he did give him, the King Taksin, the new King of Siam, gave him a title. So he was obviously very well favoured. Chow Prior Kapitan Bangken, leader of the hat-wearing people of Tonbori. Hat-wearing meant European. Because he was selling him guns to fight the Burmese, right? So he was very important to Taksin. But, so it has been said, James Scott was probably selling guns to the Burmese, and the British loved that. Oh, keep them busy fighting. But that's the old story. I mean, that's what people are still doing it now, aren't they? Selling guns to both sides in a conflict, unfortunately. But so we go into the fascinating story of Taksin through the route of Lord Tian. Now, Lord Tian in life was the eldest son of Lady Chan. He's a real character, but I know nothing about him. Nothing is recorded. But as a young noble of Phuket, it's quite likely he did fight in the wars against the Burmese because it was the armies of the south that drove the Burmese out because the north was occupied. So I've imagined this Lord Tian, who will have a connection with light because his mother knew light, and how we can get to know about the fascinating story of Siam at this time. So a lot of this book is about the destruction of Ayutthaya and the wars and what happened to Taksin at the end. So it's definitely not a British story. And then we've got two other characters. Jamual, who is the right-hand man of the new Sultan of Kedah, who is a very wily character. Light can't stand him, calls him the biggest blackguard ever. But then I actually imagine there wasn't too much between them. I think they were both men of the same ilk. He's a Chulia merchant. And although he managed to worm his way to the right-hand position in the Malay court, he was hated by the court. But young Sultan Abdullah talked to him. He's a very powerful mover and has a role in the foundation of Penang in the background. It's not all a one-way street. And then at the bottom is Raja Haja Fizibilila, and I shall only say that name once because I find it really hard to say. Better known as Raja Haji, he's the brother of Raja Lumu, the first Sultan of Selangor, became the Yamchuan Muda, the leader of the Riau Bugis, and came within that close of driving the Dutch out of Malacca. Fascinating story, a real hero, a real visionary man. And Light may very well have been selling him guns as well to get rid of the Dutch. Well, it's most likely he was. So his story is told in it. So it really is, I'm teasing out that Straits story as best as I can. And of course, in the end, we end up with Penang. And the very, very controversial moment when the flag is raised on Penang. As you know, it's without any legal sanctions, no treaty in place. Like clearly, well, I was going to say being economical with the truth with both sides, but he actually has lied outright to both sides. With his trading background, it's like, well, you know, salesman, I'll say anything, I'll sort it out later. Well, you can't do that with politics. I'm afraid Light made a really difficult future for himself by taking this move, but in other ways he had no option. Now that's controversial of me to say, and if you want to ask questions about those, definitely. I would love a debate about whether he had any right or not about that. And that's Pearl. That's where we are at Pearl. And then Emporium, the book we're going to talk about today. Light is a great success as a trader. Emporium is a very great success. Within 5 years, there's said to be 10,000 people settled. It's attracting people from everywhere. Malacca is on the decline. Kedah is probably completely on the decline now. Everybody's making for this new port. Why not? It's a free port. It seems to be a much better deal than all the other ports are offering. So financially, it's doing very well, but it's got all sorts of problems, and that's what Emporium is about. It's about this sort of poison chalice that Light takes on. The East India Company, the new General Cornwallis, is completely indifferent. He didn't give Light any permission, and he doesn't know I should invest money in it. Most of the infrastructure comes out of Light's pocket. The amount of work he has to take on, because there's hardly anybody to help him. He's got a very small administration. It's grinding him into the dirt. And so it's a really difficult task that he's taken on. Plus the fact they've still not made a treaty with Kedah. 5 years the Sultan waits for money or settlement or something. And in the end, he goes to war. I can't blame him, really. I mean, I don't know why he waited 5 years, frankly. But that's on, and it's very, very possible that Light could have lost that war. And it's very, very possible he might have lost his life within it. So, I mean, it really is a very difficult early few years for Penang. Few times Light goes over to Calcutta in that period, because now he is a name in the East India Company. And I spend a lot of time in Calcutta because Calcutta is a taste of the future. If the East India companies decide to invest in Penang, it will become a little Calcutta. Martina watches that with horror, I think. So do a lot of people. But if Light's vision, and I think he had a vision, somewhat like Farquhar in Singapore, which was much more egalitarian. He wanted more involvement of all the different communities, particularly the Chinese community, which was, of course, by far the greatest community, and he had the least trouble from, because it policed itself very well, Comsey system and so on. But is he going to be allowed that vision any more than Farquhar was allowed in Singapore? If they decide to invest, he won't get that vision. So it's like he's between a rock and a hard place. So there's an awful lot of narrative meat in those few years. This is an early map of Penang, and within 5 years to make a settlement of it is a remarkable achievement. But there's a lot of problems with the settlement. Lack of investment, disease, crime is rampant, mostly from the Europeans. There's a couple of natural disasters that throw them back. There's security issues. French are still around. Kedah's on the warpath. There's pirates all over the place. Corruption, especially among the Europeans who settle, is a really big issue. And he has no judicial authority to control any of these things. His hands are completely tied behind his back. And there's a lot of prejudice. And it's not just from the Europeans either. There's internal prejudice. It's very difficult to bring together groups of all different people from all over the region without having issues between the communities. So it's a really difficult task that Light takes on, and that's what the core of Emporium is about. But I'm not saying any more because you have to read it to know that how that plans out. But here's some of my characters, and you can see again they're from all over the place. A lot of women again in it. I couldn't not write about Jemdani. She's a character I came across in Calcutta. She's like the queen of Calcutta, this Bengali Bibi who's known to all the young gentlemen. You know, you come across these women, they're out there and there's pictures of them and nobody ever talks about them. The miniature there is actually a miniature by a famous miniaturist called Diana Hill, a woman artist in Calcutta who was very famous at the time. She painted a lot of people, and this one is one of the ladies. But I've borrowed her image for one of the characters in my book, the first British woman to settle in Penang. Now, we only know her as Mrs. Gray. We don't know where she came from, who she is, but I've made up a story for her. And although she's a bit of a pain, and she's very snobby, on the other hand, what must it have been like for one lone British woman on this settlement? And of course, if we've read our Jane Austen, we know there's very little limited options for women in those days. She's only after her husband after all, you know, and when she finds him, she's jolly well going to make the most of it. So I'm trying to tease out the British story of British women, because the British don't talk about their own women very much. And then we have Cornwallis, and then the wonderful Captain Coe, the first Captain China, Captain China, who is known by many names, and I'm not even sure if they're all him. Marcus and I were just talking about it before. Che Wan is often known as in to Penangites. And he was a very close associate of, like, they were in business together, they were in plantations together. So there's a real connection. And he's quite a mover in my story. We've even got a pirate, an Illanoon pirate, Langowan. I've introduced a pirate character. And Solomon is a grown-up man. Where is he now? This little boy brought up by a British man. How does he negotiate his world in a British society that will never accept him? So he's the other side of the coin. By the way, this image is actually Enrique of Malacca, an engraving of Enrique of Malacca, who was Magellan's companion. In fact, he actually did get around the world. Magellan died before they actually got around. But this is a little fact I cannot but tell you. When Johnny Depp, the famous actor, was making his Captain Sparrow in Pirates of the Caribbean, this is one of the images he used. So amazing how these images can get into all sorts of different novels. So that is my grown-up Solomon. So that's Emporium, and that's where I'm going to stop talking at you, and we're going to have a little chat together, and please join in the chat. I've got some information on the screen where to source the books. If you're not able to buy tonight, or you're not here tonight, if you're somebody who's listening online, so you might want to take a screenshot or a photograph of that. And I will sit down and have a drink of water now.
Thank you very much, Rose. We're just going to pause for 1 second before we move on to our discussion, because we have a little surprise. This is actually Emporium's worldwide launch. So I'm going to hand over to Marcus.
This is so heavy.
Oh, leave that. So we're just going to do a little gimmick.
Okay, 1, 2, 3. Photo opportunity. Oh, and for people who have to sign this. I'll do it up here. No, I don't want to spoil it. Just me? Okay.
There we go. Worldwide launch complete. Thank you, everyone. We'll carry on with the program now. So, if you want to come a bit closer, so it does feel like you're sat around the dinner table with us, feel free to move forward for those of you that are in the room. And for those of you online, unfortunately you can't move any closer, but maybe they'll zoom in a bit closer. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions to Rose, and hopefully you'll have an answer. And this won't turn into the usual thing that happens at dinner tables, an argument.
No, we'll be very well behaved.
We'll behave ourselves. I'll start with an easy one. I've got a couple of notes here that I want to make sure that I include. So you seem to have a preference for single word titles for your books. Why did you name the third novel in the Penang Chronicles Emporium?
Well, actually, Dragon and Pearl were once one novel. And if I move this, is that all right? When I submitted it to the publisher, and I then thought, well, I've submitted it now, and I probably will either never hear again, because that's the usual thing that happens, or it won't be for 3 months. And then a day or two later, I get this, it's from the evening, I get this mail saying, very interested in this, really want to go ahead with it, but do you have any idea how long it is? And I just wrote the darn thing, you know. I said, no, so we had this conversation on WhatsApp, and he said, well, it's about 850 pages, you know. it would be very good for blocking open the door, like, you know. And he said, new novelists never get huge novels like that. People are not prepared to pay. And he said, is there any way you could make it 2 novels? So my novel, Dragon and Pearl, which had this beautifully allegory in its title because there was, you know, the ceramic of Dragon and Pearl. You see a picture there, the dragon chasing the pearl that he can never quite catch. That was my allegory of the British trying to catch this port and he never could quite sort it out, you know. But of course, in Chinese mythology, if the dragon ever does catch the pearl, it's chaos, right? And then it's colonialism, the chaos. Oh, I think I'm pretty pleased with my title with that. But of course, it loses its momentum when you put dragon, unless you know that's true. So really, it wasn't a one-word title. But then when it came to the 3rd book, I thought, we'll have to keep up with that. And the reason why I called it Emporium, you know, my background's in actually Roman and Greek. And as I knew from my Greek that Emporium means a place where things are sold, and that's what they call these port cities. But I've always thought it's very like the Latin word imperium, which is the word where empire comes from, the word for control or command. So it struck me that Penang is an emporium about to be an imperium. It's on that very, very moment, the cusp of that. So that was my thinking in that title. So maybe I was being too close to my own word, but that's okay.
No, it's got a nice, flow through it. The 3 words and the 3 titles. But knowing that originally it was 2 books, or 1 very, very large book, is the 3rd in the 3 series volume? Is it a continuum of the first 2 books, Dragon and Pearl, or is it a book in itself, standalone?
You could read it on its own, actually, more so than the other 2, which are very closely connected, of course. I was consciously making it different. I mean, obviously, it is a continuation story. We do carry on with Light's story till he dies, So it is, in that sense, the continuous narrative. But to me, it felt it had to be a different book because the star was Penang now. You know, obviously we wanted to have the characters, but the star was, I wanted to be able to explain about all the different, those 10,000 people who were there, you know, where did they come from? And look at little vignettes, really, because I obviously can't write about 10,000 people. It would be a 2,000 word novel or a page novel. But just picks representatives. And even if I only spent a page or 2 on that little story, I was trying to build up a picture of the migration and also the Europeans who came and that sort of world. So it does go more into other people's stories as it does in Calcutta. And as I said before, when I came across a fascinating woman on the way, I thought, she's going in my book. I'm going to find a role for her in my book. So there's like the artist Diana Hill and Eliza Kidd. I'm going to read about in a moment. When I came across these lost stories, I thought this was a repository for them. So it is a little bit different in that it does bring us to a wide audience. It just always focuses on Francis and Martina.
Well, having read the book, all of them, the way that you describe early Penang is so vivid and feels so real. How did you create that world? What resources, or did it just come from somewhere deep in the back of your mind? How was that? What was that process for you?
I'm not that clever. I actually, if anything, the thing that challenges me as a writer is descriptive writing. I'm very much more narrative and dialogue-driven writer. Some writers, you read chapters and you think, oh my goodness, how could anyone have language like that on this script? I'd struggle with that, so I have to work very hard on that. But there are aids to help people like me, and I'm going to show you a few of them. There's all these wonderful Penang views. If you look at the corner of each one, to give you some idea of when they were painted. They are obviously post-light. There won't be a massive change in how things look. So there's the wonderful Penang Views book, which was put together by Datuk Sri Lim Chong Kiat. And if you can't get hold of that, it's quite difficult to get hold of. If you Google them, they have all these images you can get on Wikipedia. And, you know, it doesn't take a long time to get a picture and feel for the beauty of it. Then you didn't have condos and cranes and huge cruise ships coming into the port. That's, of course, Government House was. Obviously, closer to the beach than it might have been originally. I think this is by 1821, there's been a bit of erosion. This is one of my favourite ones. I write about the original, if you want to say, Suffolk House. It isn't, of course, Suffolk House as we know it, but Francis had some sort of, I don't know what you call it, kaboom, in the Aitam area. And there is a well-known account of a lady who visited it at its time. So I was writing about that. Then I found this is the house of Lo Ami, who was actually a Chinese miller. He owned a big flour mills. But that really answered my question. Describe that? Why not? It must have been something like that. So there's an awful lot of paintings which help to set that. No, that's another thing about that. No, go back. That's just in case they come up in the conversation. But I mean, Penang, although it's very overbuilt in some places, it's very untouched in other places. And I've spent a lot of time over my life in Penang, and I sit on beaches and I just look at the sky and I think, really describe those colours and look at the sea at different times of day. You have to be here, don't you? It's got a very special feel, Penang. And even now you can get away from it. There's other places you can get away from it. But I'm not clever enough to, I might imagine a story in my head, but I had to use other aids to describe what it must have been like in those days.
I beg to differ. I think you are clever enough. One of my favorite parts of all three of the books, but specifically at Emporium, are the female characters that you have created. They make a huge impact in the narrative, and they're not just the usual bit parts, the behind-the-scenes characters or the love interests. They're very integral to the story. How did you find out so much about these women? And I know that you mentioned earlier that historically female characters are quite often not documented. But how did you create them?
Well, take Lady Chan, for example. A novelist finds something about one person, and there's more known about Lady Chan. And there's ways you can actually take elements of that life and place it on somebody else. I do it in my male characters as well. Something happened to another country trader, so I say it happened to, So there are little snippets you can come across. But one of the things that was in my mind about women was when I came here as a young bride many, many years ago. I just out of university and I knew all I was a woman's liver. I thought it was going to be very kind of in age, we were going to be very. But when I got here, I found out the women were just so dynamic and powerful, and they were wives and mothers. They did all the traditional roles, but behind the scenes, always the women in Asian families, Chinese, Malay, Indian, they were matriarchs. And I know that most people in the room recognize that. It's the older women of the family that are often the ones who are in charge. And you often get a situation where the men are in the coffee house having endless cups of coffee and cigarettes and discussing problems. And it's the women who are running the stall in the market, who are buying shares and, all different ways. And I suddenly realized Asian women have an agency. They always have had. And I don't think that would have changed very much. And I actually feel that women of the Straits in the late 18th, early 19th century may very well have had more agency than their English counterparts, who have a very limited options. Again, I go back to Jane Austen, So I sort of used almost my intuition. I've actually used stories that Nanny, her grandma, who tell me back a few generations, and she was a great character. Things she came out with, which even women with bound feet who had an awful lot of power in the household, I suddenly realized that we don't really, I'm talking about back in the West, we don't understand age at these points, are very uninformed. And it became, and the role of women was a real driver. I wanted to tell the stories of women, and I wanted to compare them to the women of Britain, which I'm able to do in the book. because I think we in the West, they are very, very naive about how society really is structured over here. But yeah, women are very underrepresented in all of this. It's very, very wrong. And it's always an impression that they didn't have significant lives. Of course, they had significant lives. They bothered to tell the story, and I think that was where I was.
I also think that there's another element that features strongly in all three of the books, and it's another group that's often erased in history, and that's the mixed heritage of the region and of the time, and in modern times and in the past as well. What was the intent behind that? Is that something that's personal, or is that an observation you made as you went through the historical documentation?
As I mentioned before, it's our own story. But I feel that Senegal, Southeast Asia is like nowhere else, really. There has been such a blending of peoples for such a very long time. It's very hard sometimes to even identify which place somebody in. I mean, they're not usually placed in one group, but I mean, there's this term in America, cultural appropriation. People are very, very concerned about cultural appropriation, and I think to myself, nobody in Malaysia really understand what that means, because being culturally appropriated from each other for thousands of years, food, clothes, language. And I know that politics divide us. I understand that. I'm not naive to that. But that's not what happens amongst people themselves. People themselves are I'm culturally appropriating an outfit here, but nobody's offended that I'm doing that. Yes, sorry.
I just discussion about what you raised. My name is Tim. I'm a very close and ardent fan of Mrs. Langdon's series, and yours is a very refreshing historical fiction kind of genre. But my question is very simple. Can I ask how much of the poets have poetic justice? How much of poetic and also literary justice into this?
You mean the poetic license kind of thing? Yes. Well, actually, at the end of Emporium, I do explain that. When I've really taken I suppose, big invention is actually Martinha. That is, of course, I mean, I'd be horrified if people really thought that was the case. I did that to enable me to develop Martinha, but also to kind of explain Light's very long connection with Phuket. It gave me an into that. So there are some very, very obvious poetic license areas like that, which I do explain in the end of the book. There isn't a great deal of poetic license. Other than that, I've taken all the anecdotes. For example, the story of Light firing gold coins from the ship into the Tanjung Pinang, so that the workers would be more keen to clear the ground because they might find some gold coins there. Which is obviously a apocryphal story, probably didn't happen. But I found a way to work that in, slightly different than that story. I've taken every single little legend and story and I've used those. Now, they are obviously not historically proven, but enough people talk about those stories to make them, she's managed to get that in there. Oh, she's got that in there. I've tried to take everything, whether it was historical or it was just a story told. But oddly enough, the things that seem the greatest invention are actually the true things. For example, somebody asked me at another talk I did, well, that scene in Kedah when the English make such a fool of themselves in front of the Sultan of Kedah, and he loses his temper, and they just make that up, did it? And I said, well, actually, James Scott wrote a letter where the Sultan of Kedah was so angry, and he said, I asked for a treaty, and they sent me a stuttering boy. So, I mean, yeah, they really did have this sort of blowing his top and saying, get out of here to the English, you know. That seemed like I just made it up because it was a good fight scene, you know. But in actual fact, the most amazing thing was really strange things I made up. So there is an awful lot of hard to believe incidents in Light's life that are actually true. So I would say, obviously, and it's more on Martinha's side, I have made some real leaps where you have to put things together that really should have gone together because there's no other way to do it. But by and large, there's not that many instances of that in the book. I've just kind of played with them a little. I hope that answers that.
Thank you so much for your question.
Yeah.
I've got one more question before we go into a reading. And then after that, we will open it up to have more of an interactive Q&A session. This is a bit of a prickly one, so get ready. The settlement of Penang is controversial. We have to kind of acknowledge that. Many Malaysians now are critical of Light's behavior. Did Light play out the Sultan of Kedah? Is it time to review the events in a more critical light? And I mean, I'm asking a lot of questions here. Do we really need another story of a colonial white savior that's male? Do we really need that?
There's a lot of questions there, and I think it's a perfectly correct question to ask, particularly in this day and age. I remember there was that crazy COVID summer of 2020 when all over the world they were pulling statues down. In Penang, they daubed Light with red paint, I believe, and they were talking about cancel culture and all these kind of things. And I think we have to face our controversies. I think we have to talk about the things that are unpalatable to. There's a lot going on in universities that disturbs me now. People are no longer talking about a colonial era because it's so offensive. What does that solve? You know, I mean, as a historian, I'd be lost if I couldn't talk about things like that. My job would be finished, wouldn't it? I think we have very much more to ask those questions of our past, questions that weren't asked before. We mustn't shy away from what happened. We cannot change history. We cannot leave the bits out we don't want to hear about. We can't pretend they didn't happen. We can't say they happened differently because we wish they did. All those things are very important. But we must ask the questions, and we mustn't be afraid to condemn if we do find negative answers. And I can personally say, as far as I'm quite taken with Francis Light, but I'm also very well aware of his failings. He was no better than he ought to have been, and he was a man of his time. And there are some things he did that he might have said, I had no alternative. But he probably did have an alternative. It's just not an alternative he wished to take. But there's all sorts of other things that go around that. Like, for example, did the Sultan of Kedah actually open it? Surely it was part of Siam. If, you know, maybe he should have asked the king of Siam for it. I mean, people are coming from all different. If you're in Thailand, that's what they kind of think, you know. Everybody has a different angle on it. But one thing we must remember about Land, and I'm not defending Light for launching him without a treaty, because we shouldn't have done that in many ways. But in this period, on both sides of the coin, what is territorial possession? It's who is there at any given time. Phuket is an island, for example, which in the 18th century was French, was Malay, Bugis, back to Siamese again. Then it went to Kedah with that at one point. I mean, if you go in with a bigger army, it's yours. What did a territorial boundary mean in the Straits? Nothing. They couldn't draw a map of exactly where. This was jungle, wasn't it? Forest. What a state meant for Malay Sultan was the people who recognized him and followed his adat. It was to do with people rather than land boundaries. Now, I'm not excusing Light, but I'm saying it's a very fluid thing. We're careful not judging territory and ownership by the legal standards of the modern world as well. Things were very, very flexible. Now, you may wish to disagree with me. Great, because I love debate like that. But my standpoint as a woman of my era was that he did something wrong and he thought he could paper over the cracks later. And then he found he couldn't. And then he had to make it, one of my characters says, two of my characters on different sides of the thing say, you need to make your mind up. Pick a side.
Which side is he going to come down? Is he going to come down on the side of the Straits, where he's been most of his adult life, where most of his friends are and his wife's from? Or is he going to come down on the side of the British who kind of rejected him in the end? You go with a side that's going to be more useful to you, more pragmatic. And that's what he did, you know. So I'm not making any great brief for what he did, but he did it. Once it was done, it was done. And then a chain of history was set in place. And that's why I think we have to be very careful about pretending we can unravel that simply by pretending it wasn't there. If there's anything that we can learn from that, is that what's going on now, and there are problems in every country now, is all resting on our past history. And the only way we can possibly even get to the beginning of understanding where we are now is to unravel that past history as it was, not as you'd like it to be. So that's the case I would make for that.
I think that's great. I think you're absolutely right. Looking into the past to understand the future and the present is a very key and critical thing that we quite often don't do and or don't want to do because it's something that doesn't look that great. Now, we're going to move on to listen to a reading from Rose. This is from Emporium and it's chapter 2. It's a small extract, it's not the whole chapter. And it's called Caucasiana. Do you want to stand up for this?
Yes,
or?
I will. Okay. My teacher hat on now. I'd like to stand up when I'm reading. This is very early on. And Emporium begins a year or so on from the settlement with a visitor arriving, and he's called Alexander Kidd. He's a major from Calcutta. Basically, he's been sent by Cornwallis to survey this new island. Is it worth us keeping it? And really, Cornwallis wants to hear the answer no. I think he'd be quite happy with that. But Alexander Kidd is an engaging character, and he's just arrived. The first day he's there, early morning, light takes him for a walk around Georgetown. They end up in La Bucina. And he takes him to a house of chap I showed you before, Captain Coe. And this is the sort of engagement that happens between them. So they've just been introduced. Captain Coe weighed up the tall, fair Scotsman with a keen eye. His skin will burn like char siu pork, he replied. He had presumed it was an exchange of formal politeness. He speaks no Malay, Captain, I answered with a twinkle in his eye. But you are not wrong. Our weather is not kind to those as fair as he. Coe chuckled. Have you eaten? Come, let's go inside and take some food. Men cannot talk business on empty stomachs. So Chinese. They entered a reception room at the front of his house, separated from the living room by an ornately carved kitchen. Mahogany and pearl chairs lined the walls in solemn. In the center of the space, a round marble top table was already set with bowls of steaming soup and platters of dumplings. Servants poured tiny cups of aromatic tea. Coe took his place, the other men joined him. Coe gesticulated by taking up his chopsticks and miming the act of eating. Kidd picked up a set and placed them back down again, looking helpless. Light grinned, took his own and demonstrated. Kidd tried again and failed. With a wave of his hand, Coe called for fork and spoon. An embarrassed Major Kidd suspected the whole charade had been done on purpose for the amusement of the captain, and perhaps the superintendent too. But Kidd found the food unexpectedly appetizing, light, fresh, flavoursome, oddly suited as breakfast fare. Even the perfumed tea complemented the dishes, cleansing the palate of the aromatic flavours. After they had done justice to their bowls, Coe folded his arm across his prosperous belly, ready to begin. The conversation took some time, for each remark had to be relayed in 2 languages and occasionally a third, if Coe could not express himself in Malay. In that case, he brought over a flunky who translated into either fluent Malay or very poor English for their benefit. The gist of the following audience was that Captain Coe was willing to be interviewed about his community. He would provide guides to show the British major around the Chinese village. He was curious why the major had been sent from India, demonstrating his shrewdness. Coe understood this was not a social trip. Your governor in Calcutta, why he not yet agreed to treaty?
Ko asked, bluntly, unafraid to rush in where others feared to tread. These meetings take time, sir, Kid replied guardedly. Ko harumphed. Take too long, then someone else will. An island gone. Let me tell you something, Major. Many Chinese people come here, work hard. They already live under Malays, Bugis, Dutch. They don't want that anymore. But if your company not make it up its mind, trouble coming, and people leave. You are fools to waste this chance. This good place, Superintendent Light, good man. That is what Chinese people say. Light could scarcely restrain a smile at Ko's accurate assessment. He had been saying much the same to the council in every letter he wrote to Bengal. It was of particular significance that the same advice was now emanating from the leader of the largest community on the island. But then Light had known exactly what Ko would say. They had discussed this meeting at length in the days before Kit's arrival. The interlude only served to increase Kit's curiosity about Ko's origins. If I may ask, what brought you to the island, Captain Ko? Ko remembered. I have lived many lives in many places. One day, perhaps I tell you my story. Enough for now that Captain Light offered me and my people a safe place on this island. We repay him with our labor to build this fine new place. It's suspected that behind the scant explanation lay a fascinating tale. With much bowing and ceremony and the gift of an exquisite lacquer box containing preserved fruits, the audience came to an end. As the two British gentlemen withdrew, with as much stately courtesy as they could muster, soaked in sweat and red-faced as they were, Captain Ko observed their department with wry amusement. He had plenty of time for Superintendent Light, but this major was another pompous fool whose long nose was perfectly shaped for looking down on others. No matter, Ko would have the last laugh.
Thank you very much. Rose, now it's over to you, audience. If you have any burning questions, maybe stick your hand up and one of our wonderful colleagues from Penang Institute will come with a microphone. When you get the microphone, please introduce yourself first so the audience that are online can hear, and don't speak without a microphone. We can hear you in the room, but those online can't. Don't be afraid. No question? Oh, I think we have. Okay, we have one. Over to you, sir. And then.
Hello, my name is Julian. This summer, I was in Suffolk cycling around, and then I've been wondering since then what gave Light his courage. I've been wondering whether it was Martinha gave his courage. Now, I think you've shown us that it's true. Let's say it's true anyway. Are you going to write a book now about Martinha? Because she lived on for a lot longer. The 4th and 5th and 6th stories. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I kind of thought I could get to Martinha's story in the 3rd book, but I was getting up to that 400 page mark again. No, the thing was I realized that it made more sense to end with the death of Light. So I was somewhat conflicted that I hadn't taken the story on. And I was also very conscious that the children have fascinating lives, and that takes you literally all over the world. And they represent another age of Light, and the early 19th century. And so I have now started on the 4th novel. It's the 4th novel of a trilogy, which makes absolutely no sense unless you're Irish. But I see it more as a companion because it's obviously the story of Light is told. But I think the family, and I've got one member of the descendant here, I think there is a very interesting process in trying to see where that went, their lives. These children of a mixed heritage relationship who went on to significant lives, which they all did in their different ways, all over the world. And I felt it was a shame. It would be wrong not not to follow that through. But I agree with you. I've been to Dallinghoo. I was invited by Woodbridge to come and talk there, and I was a guest of Woodbridge School, which is fabulous. I went into the old school where Francis went. I was shown a register with his name on it that they had, you know, and all the schoolboys that I mentioned in my book were with him, and they obviously very interested in him. And then you see these villages are so close to each other, beautiful. It's the most beautiful countryside of England. But all the places mentioned in his story, they're only like a mile and a half from each other. And you realize it's such a small world. What drives somebody from such a small world to then go away and never come back? You know, and you know, it really fascinates me how people make those decisions. Because, of course, now we never make a decision like that. We're always only a WhatsApp message away from anyone in the world. But with a letter taking 18 months at minimum, sometimes, you know, it takes extraordinary courage. So I think he had extraordinary courage to begin with to do it. But I think also people have no option. I mean, people like were economic migrants in modern day terms. He was an illegitimate young man with a good education who could do nothing at home. We had to go. And I think we have to look at, because that's another question we would ask. What's the difference between him and someone else who leaves for a better life elsewhere in the modern world? We see these things as different. But thank you for raising that. And yes, there's a little bit about the fourth book at the very end of Emporium. It advertises that. And hopefully, it'll take me a bit longer because it's a new project. I'm hoping for a 2025 release for that.
Thank you, Julian, for that really fascinating question. Over to you, sir.
Thanks. My name is Clement. I'm very fascinated by the story, and definitely like a lot of people talk about this Martinha Rozells, this mysterious woman, like different characters, play different roles, dressed in different, costume, whatever. And of course, you just said that she's supposed to die in Penang, but the later parts of her life was like mystery, where she was supposed to have some argument with James Scott, because James Scott was thought to squander the property or whatever. So there's a last part of her life in Penang. It's like, what did she do? I mean, how she?
Well, obviously, it's limited what we know. We know a little bit, but it's a very sad resulting story because, yes, there is this notion that James Scott played around, allowing her to take all the things that she should have got in the will. But if you look at Light's will, he's got a lot of land. He's land rich. He's got a lot of money. He's got a lot of possessions even. And the story of Wise, although she is, when he was building up Penang, he was financing much of it from his own fortune. And without James Scott and some of the other supporters, and I think to some extent Captain Coe was one of them because he went into partnership with him. Without those people, I don't think he'd have gone as far as he could. So I don't think it's fair to be so harsh on James Scott. There's absolutely no evidence that he played Martinha. In fact, there's more evidence pointing out to the fact that he tried very hard to support her. It was, although she did take legal cases against the Scott family later, it was after he died. He had been in his way supporting her. Basically, it was a deal about the land. He kind of bought the land and gave him money annually, and that was paid right up to his death. But once he died, his sons held on to the land and didn't give her the lease money for it, and she took them to court for it. And she did actually win a few years back pay for that. But there's all sorts of issues. There were definitely other people involved in it, and it wasn't really Scott. There's no evidence really for Scott. Before Scott's got this. And it's really his family rather than him personally. But the story of her later life is sad. She married again, and she was played out by her second husband. He's the real culprit, if there is one. And he seems to be forgotten in the story, but and she had more children. And I think the youngest son, Francis, and the two daughters she had by her second husband, they lived quite an impoverished life. I think that their future was very sad. And there's lots of questions about that because by then, her daughters are well established in Calcutta. Son William is obviously an officer in Europe. It's unclear as to why there wasn't. I mean, it's something we have, and that's why I think there's potential for a novel there. to try to understand. And then the youngest son, Francis, didn't get the opportunities William get. He didn't get an education. He wasn't brought up as a gentleman. His life was quite a harsh one, I think, William. I think he went. He died young, and his children were very impoverished. They were brought up in Penang, very impoverished in his life. So there is a sad element to this. And certainly there's the famous story of Sarah Wright's husband. By then, I think he was a major, later to become a General Welsh, visited Penang about 1818 or something like that. And he just said, well, there's nothing, the children got nothing from this island after all their father did. But I think he was building up a little bit of a sort of story he didn't really understand. I don't think the children understood how impoverished it was when he died. Had he had a few more years, things might have turned around. But lots of the reasons for his impoverishment, apart from what he was paying out to Penang, in the infrastructure of Penang, was also his investments in Calcutta went awry. Now, I think there's a little bit of question about that. His partner in Calcutta was a man called William Fairley, who does feature in the novels, and he's a very, very, very wealthy man in Calcutta. He says, "Oh, our shares of money." He's a banker, like he banked the money. The Napoleonic, not the Revolutionary Wars have destroyed everything and all that. And he thought he had a fortune of £20,000, and something is only down to, I don't know, a few £1,000s. And I find that very strange because it doesn't seem to affect really fairly. And I think he was cheated. She was cheated after because he should have had more money that was in his bank. So I think there are people around the story, but James Scott certainly isn't the one we should be really blaming. I think there's other people involved. But he just didn't have the money. He couldn't even afford. He had plans to buy an estate in England, and he couldn't even afford that by the last year of his life. And I'm sure these are the things that hastened his death, really. He had a lot of worries in those last few years. And certainly when he was major, he wrote letters to his friend in England saying, more or less saying, have you ever heard of a pioneer who made any money out of it? You know, more or less is acknowledging that he's done something great, but he has no money to show for it. You know? So it is.
Thank you, Clement, for that question. Are there any other questions from the audience? Charlie. Well, if there's no question, I have another question to ask you, if you don't mind. I wanted to understand a little bit about Francis Light's title. Like, was he ever a sir? Did that happen or not?
A lot of people ask me that at talks, and I have to say, I'm trying to get up the courage to write to Tantuane's publishers and point out that in Gift of Rain, he refers to Sir Francis Light, and Sir Francis Light was never a sir. He never went back to England again. He left around 1765 or something like that, and he never came back to England again. And he get down on his knee and be dubbed. I mean, that's the way it works. Raffles, however, was actually booted out of Java and did go back to England and managed to manoeuvre a knighthood for himself whilst he was home. But you can't just take on the title because you're an important person. It has to be given by the group or the royal family. So no, he never was. And yet it was something that all the school books said he was Sir Francis Light. So every Malaysian is convinced he's Sir Francis Light because it was in Ireland when I was at school. And they've been challenged by a few Malaysians. I didn't learn that when I was at school. It was just a convention, one of those sort of anecdotal things. That wasn't the case. He wasn't even the governor of Penang, he was only superintendent. So that was like a lower rank governor sort of thing. So he never really got that. And his highest military title, I guess, was captain, because he was captain of he was captain of the ship. He wasn't captain of the Navy, he was lieutenant in the Navy. And he was given the honorary captain's position at the time he was negotiating a treaty that never got signed. He was given that title when he came over then, but never higher than that. So yes, it's a shame that he never really got a recognition from the British Crown. If he'd gone home, maybe. Yes.
My name is Ahmad Fazal. I want to talk about one aspect of Martinha Rozells' life, in that she was a Catholic, and her role, the role that she played in helping large numbers of Catholics who were refugees and that came over here, and the fact that the Catholic community had an amazing role in Penang, far beyond its numbers.
Oh, wow, far beyond.
Bishop Street, Church Street, and we had actually the first university in 1817 or something, but just a college in general, which trained the Catholic priests for the whole of the region, from Myanmar and others. I wonder if this is
well, it is. There is a big issue about the Catholic thing. Obviously, as a Catholic myself, I was quite intrigued by that. It was one of those, that is one of the moments when I feel Martina's hand behind, because I obviously wouldn't have been interested in anything Catholic. But the very central role the Catholic community play in the early days. I mean, the first, well, I say church, but it was probably just a little hut. But the French missionary priests who came over at the same time, it's something like August the 15th, 4 days after the settlement of Penang, when they officially opened their chapel. I mean, 4 days later, they were already ready. They obviously had been building this because the bees was going on through July. And it's well known that Lai absolutely couldn't stand them because of the French spies. And in fact, they probably were, because the French were always, the priests were very inclined to report back to base. And he was very happy when the French Monsignor goes off to India and a German comes to take over the Catholic Church. So he would not have been instrumental, but that has to be Martina's hand and the Catholic community. We also know that there are other Rozells in Penang. Their names feature. Now, where do they come from? Are they relatives? I suspect they probably came from Malacca or something like that, or they could have come from South. And it brings this whole thing about the Portuguese Eurasians. And they are forgotten people, really. And I do think actually a lot of the Eurasians, whether they're Dutch Eurasians, they don't figure in either this, that, and where are they in it? Nobody in Malaysia is talking about them. But the Portuguese Eurasians obviously originated in Malacca. And then when the Dutch came, they went, obviously many of them left. And the places they went to were either Phuket, where there was a very lively Eurasian community, or Kedah. Kedah was quite welcoming to them, so there were Eurasian communities there. And then when Thaksin went a bit mad, he took it against the Catholics in exam. He gave an order that all Portuguese Eurasians either leave or die. And they literally had to, they became migrants immediately, they just left. And in fact, the bishop died on the journey. He was a very old man. And they came back to Kedah. But when Penang was being mooted, they basically went onto the ship where a group of Portuguese Eurasians just begged, can we go to the island and settle there because we're just not wanted anywhere? And that we'll work really hard and we'll help you settle. So, I mean, it was just a small boatload, and then people started flocking from the other areas. There was actually, Portuguese Eurasians were not supposed to leave for Penang. The Dutch tried to keep them there because they felt that was like, they were enemies. They didn't want to go to the enemy territory. But many did. Chancellor Armand did. And I suspect some of the Rozells may have been in Malacca. I don't know where, but there are more Rozells. And in fact, in his will, Francis leaves a small amount of money to a female a lady and a small daughter. Where they fit into the whole picture, we don't know. But a lot of charity work is done from the very early days. And the first school, if you could call it that, was provided by the Catholic community. Again, I feel it was helped by the fact that Martina had influence and said to come on, even though he wasn't very interested, even though he didn't like the priest, he gave permission for all these things. So I definitely think that's a very fascinating, not very well known story. It's something that I did try to work into books. It's very much there in the books.
the Catholic story too.
Thank you. Thank you very much,
I know
Anna, for that
we're looking
question.
at-
We haven't got any more time for questions, but after the final reading of Rose is going to do, we will have half an hour of book signing, so you can ask any questions you want from her at that point. But this next part is going to be a reading from chapter 7. It's a conversation between Eliza Kidd and Martina, and it's called The Art of Illusion.
This is about women, and I imagine that Martina went to Calcutta. Her daughters are in school there, and she's actually at this visit on her own. I mean, she's not on her own; she's got chaperones and everything, but Francis isn't with her, and her position is untenable. She can't really move in society as a woman of the Straits. So she's stuck in this house with a family a British family that are looking after the goose. Not going out very much. And then one afternoon, on a very hot afternoon, she gets a visitor. And it's Mrs. Eliza Kidd, who is the wife of Alexander Kidd, who we met in the first reading. Mrs. Kidd was possibly the most beautiful woman Martina had ever seen. After a month or so of well-fed Pigou ladies, family she stayed with, whose gowns could scarce constrain their girth and whose white powdered cheeks wobbled as they preened, Eliza Kidd was a different species, a goddess amongst women. Mrs. Light, how good of you to receive me at this inhospitable hour. Pardon my presumption. Her voice was as perfectly modulated as the rest of her, a mellifluous enunciated English that was harmony to the ears. I am delighted that you called. Come sit down, and my girl will serve refreshments. On a shady veranda, fanned by one of the houseboys, they took cool lemon tea. My husband, Major Kidd, has spoken most highly of you, Mrs. Lang. He's so enjoyed his time on Prince of Wales Island, and has most particularly insisted that I introduce myself. Major Alexander has been a good friend to our island, Mrs. Kidd, but despite the graciousness of the exchange, the two ladies were aware they each were assessing each other's mettle. Eliza jutted her chin forward with a kind of playfulness, looking Martina up and down quite openly. I must say, I wholly agree with my husband's assessment. It is a most prosperous settlement, Martina responded properly. I do not speak of your island, my dear. I was referring to you. Major Kidd mentioned you rarely spoke English, yet he was convinced you understood all that was said. And he was right. Your English is perfectly acceptable, she continued gaily, as if amused by her own wit. Martina was less entertained. She did not intend to be a figure of fun for another silly Englishwoman. I understand your language well enough, but it is not my inclination to indulge in idle gossip around dinner tables with gentlemen. It is not acceptable in my culture to do so. Mrs. Kidd gave another mysterious smile before peeling off one of her lace gloves, tossing it onto her lap. To Martina's astonishment, the ivory pale skin of her extended palm was intricately embellished with henna motifs. I do not mean to make you feel ill at ease, my dear, the very opposite. I show you my hand as proof that we have much in common. I, as you, am a child of two heritages. I wish to extend the hand of friendship in the hope that I may make your stay more amenable, as your husband did for mine on the island. Two heritages? But you are so, she wasn't sure if it was polite to continue the thought. So white? Yes, I am I not? And God be praised, so is my son James. You can imagine how the vultures were circling to catch the first glimpse of him. She chuckled mirthfully. In Calcutta, if a woman is remarkably beautiful and knows how to play the coquette, it is possible for her to create an illusion of acceptability. I look and speak like a perfect English rose. In fact, I am the darling of this town. Until my back was turned, of course. She shrugged as if it was of no concern, but there was bitterness all the same. The illusion is but transitory, of course. My true story is suspected by all. Does Major Kidd know? Martina wondered. Forgive me if I am too forward now. Of course he does. Alexander is amused by it all. He says it adds to your allure. Gentlemen worry far less about such things than the prim ladies of society. Their morals are more accommodating where the exotic is concerned. But make no mistake, if my skin were browner or my eyes were black, then I too would have been confined to the Zanana. Even by dear Major Kidd, Eliza had insulted. On the other hand, Mrs. Light, you comport yourself in a wholly different manner. You wear your native clothes with pride. You have the courage not to pander to society. I am so captivated by your audacity. That the alluring Mrs. Kidd might find a simple girl from the Straits an object of admiration came as a profound shock to Martina. It is not courage, Mrs. Kidd, Martina insisted. I come from the Straits. It is very different from India. Our people have mixed for generations. I prefer to be what I am. If that is not acceptable in Calcutta, then so be it. I will return home soon enough where I belong, she explained in her guileless fashion. Eliza shook her head sadly in response. But I have nowhere else to return to, so must continue on this merry dance. Please, would you call me Eliza, and may I call you Martina? You may be the only person in town with whom I might truly be myself.
So thank you, everyone. That brings us to a close of a really very wonderful evening from my perspective. I hope you enjoyed it too. Before we end, I just want to say a few thank yous. Firstly, a thank you to the audience online and the audience in the room, and those of you who really enabled the session to be interactive and engaging and a real delight for everybody. I also want to say a big thank you to Marcus of Entropop Publisher, the book distributor in Penang, Leslie Lim of Pansing, the book distributors in Asia, and the Executive Director, Dr. Wei Hebeng and Zhe Xian and the Penang Institute team for coordinating this event and kindly hosting us all this evening. And finally, a huge thank you to Rose for sharing her knowledge and her thoughts and experience of both writing the books and falling in love with the characters, which I think we all have. Thank you very, very much, Rose. Thank you all. And one more thing, please don't go without buying a book if you haven't got one already. Or if you want to have your book signed with Rose, feel free to come up and form a queue. Rose will sign up and chat with you. Thank you very much, everyone. Take care and good night. Oh, over to Mark. Sorry.
Just a few words. Thank you so much. I do hope you enjoyed it. Rose is a speaker and brings a whole new dimension to not only talk like this, but this goes through her books. I mean, I'm a fan when it comes to writing history and so on, but Rose is too. She's a very, very thorough historian, and I can see how much research she has done in all of these books to build a whole historical truth, and then embellish it with all the imaginary parts that needed to be built in. So it's a new perspective on a factual story, if you like. But they're very engaging books. I've read them all. I find them fascinating. So, and thank you very much, Rose. And thank you very much, Zoe. It was fantastic. Now, I've put my Entrepreneur Publishing hat on now, and the books are for sale here tonight. They're 20% off just for tonight. Sorry, all those people online. You'll have to buy them from all these outlets online. But 20% off tonight. So Rose will sign the books as well, so you can deal with that. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming along. And please buy a book. Enjoy it. You won't regret buying a book. 40 ringgit, not much. Thank you very much. Thank you.